Prince Zuko's redemption arc is widely considered the greatest in television history. But if you look closely at his decisions, he wasn't trying to change. He was trapped in a terrifying psychological loop. Psychologists call it a repetition compulsion, a glitch in the human mind that forces a traumatized child to unconsciously recreate their worst nightmares over and over again, desperately hoping that this time, the monster will finally love them back. Zuko didn't chase the Avatar for 3 years because he cared about honor. He did it because his brain was completely hardwired to seek approval from the exact man who set his face on fire. And to understand how he broke that cycle, we have to look at the invisible psychological prison he almost never escaped. Here's the version of Zuko most people carry around in their heads. A banished prince, burned and humiliated by his own father, sent out to sea with a broken ship and an impossible task: capture the Avatar, restore his honor, come home. For 3 seasons, we watch him chase a 12-year-old airbender across the world, and somewhere along the way, he grows a conscience. He meets his uncle's wisdom halfway. He has a change of heart. He joins the good guys. Redemption complete. Roll credits. It's a beautiful story. It's also, I'd argue, almost completely wrong. Because if you actually track what Zuko does, scene by scene, season by season, you don't see a boy slowly becoming good. You see a boy trapped in a loop, chasing the same unreachable thing again and again, using different strategies, different disguises, different justifications, but always circling back to the exact same wound. Stay with me here, because once you see this pattern, you cannot unsee it. To understand the loop, you have to understand the moment it was built. And it wasn't built slowly. It was built in about 90 seconds. In an arena, in front of an entire nation. Zuko is 13 years old. He speaks out of turn in a war council, objecting to a plan that would sacrifice young soldiers as a diversion. It's arguably the single most moral thing anyone in that room does. He's horrified at the idea of children being used as bait. He says so. And for that, his own father challenges him to an Agni Kai, a formal firebending duel, one where the loser is traditionally burned or worse. Here's the part that gets skipped over in casual conversation about this scene, and it's the part that matters most. Zuko assumes he'll be fighting the general whose plan he criticized. He turns around ready to face a grown man, a soldier, someone his own size relative to the threat. Instead, he finds his father standing across from him. Read that sentence again. A father formally challenging his own teenage son to single combat in front of a crowd as punishment for showing empathy. Zuko drops to his knees immediately. He doesn't fight. He begs. He tells his father he only spoke out of love for his country. And Ozai's response isn't comfort. It isn't even neutral cruelty. It's a lesson, delivered with total calm, that Zuko needs to learn respect, and that suffering will be his teacher. Then he burns his own son's face, in front of the entire Fire Nation elite, and banishes him. Now here's where most retellings of this story stop, because the physical horror of it is so overwhelming that people rarely sit with the psychological architecture underneath it. But that architecture is everything, because in that single scene, Ozai didn't just injure Zuko's face. He installed a rule into Zuko's nervous system that would run silently in the background for years. Love from my father is not something I am given. It's something I have to earn through pain, and I currently do not deserve it. That's not a metaphor. That's the literal internal logic of a child who has just been physically punished by a parent for expressing compassion. And once that rule gets installed at 13, in a moment of maximum vulnerability, it doesn't just sit there quietly. It starts running the whole show. Before we go further, I want to slow down on the concept from the intro, because this isn't just a dramatic phrase I'm throwing around for a hook. It's a real, documented psychological pattern. The idea traces back to early trauma theory and has been refined by decades of attachment and trauma research since. In simple terms, when a child experiences overwhelming pain from a caregiver, someone they biologically depend on for survival and love, the child's brain doesn't process that caregiver as dangerous. Avoid at all costs. It's more complicated and more tragic than that. Because the child still needs that caregiver, evolution didn't build children to abandon the adults who feed and shelter them, even when those adults are the source of harm. So the child's mind does something strange to survive the contradiction. It starts believing that if it can just figure out the right formula, Be good enough, obedient enough, impressive enough, silent enough, the caregiver's cruelty will finally convert into love. This belief almost never gets stated consciously. Nobody walks around thinking, I am recreating my abuse in the hope of a different outcome. It operates underneath language, in behavior, and the tragic part is that adults who carry this pattern often recreate the same relational dynamic, with new people entirely chasing approval from bosses who remind them of a parent, staying in relationships that replicate old wounds, mistaking anxiety and yearning for chemistry and love. Now hold that definition in your head and watch what Zuko does for the next 3 seasons. Here's the belief the show wants you to sit with early on. Zuko is hunting the Avatar because capturing him will restore his honor and let him come home. But honor is doing a lot of quiet work in that sentence, and it's worth asking what honor actually means to a boy in Zuko's position. Honor, in the Fire Nation's court, in Ozai's household specifically, was never an abstract virtue. It was a currency. It was the thing that determined whether you were worthy of love in that family. Zuko's own sister was praised constantly, effortlessly, for being naturally gifted and ruthless. Zuko had to work, sweat, and bleed for every scrap of approval he ever got, and even then it rarely came. So when Zuko says he's chasing honor, what he actually means, underneath the words, is, I am chasing the specific condition my father set for loving me. Ozai gave him an assignment with an impossible scope. Find and capture the one person the entire world's most powerful military couldn't locate for 100 years, and told him that completing it was the price of re-entry into the family. That's not a redemption path. That's a rigged game, deliberately designed by a man who almost certainly never expected his son to succeed, and probably didn't want him to. Here's the detail that always gets me. Zuko doesn't quietly accept a life in exile and try to build something new. He builds his entire adolescence around one goal: prove myself worthy to the man who scarred me. Every action for 3 years, the storms he sails through, the injuries he shrugs off, the sleep he sacrifices, all of it is aimed at satisfying the exact person who created the wound in the first place. That's the loop. Not, I want to go home. I want the man who hurt me to finally decide I was worth loving all along. This is where it gets genuinely eerie, because the show doesn't just tell us Zuko is stuck in a psychological pattern. It shows us, by putting him in front of authority figures again and again, and having him respond the exact same way every time, kneeling, begging, offering himself up for judgment. Watch the pattern. Version 1. The Agni Kai itself. Zuko on his knees, begging his father for mercy, insisting his intentions were good. Version 2. Later, reunited with his father after finally believing he's succeeded, Zuko presents what he thinks is proof he's captured the Avatar. When it turns out to be a trick, when he's humiliated in front of the court again, his instinct isn't rage, it's the same posture. Explain yourself, prove your loyalty, beg for reconsideration. Version 3. And this one is the one that should make your skin crawl once you notice it. The lightning storm. Zuko, alone on the deck of his ship, in the middle of a violent storm, screaming up at the sky, demanding to know why his own father hates him, why he was banished, what he did to deserve any of it. He's not talking to the storm. He's talking to Ozai. He is having the actual conversation his father refuses to have with him, except he has to stage it alone, in a hurricane, because the real man will never sit still long enough to hear it. 3 different scenes, 3 different seasons, 3 different physical settings, same posture, same plea, same audience of one, whether that man is physically present or not. That's not a character having varied experiences on a journey. That's a nervous system stuck on a loop, replaying the original trauma in different costumes, because the original wound was never actually addressed. It was only ever reburied. I want to introduce a second concept here, because repetition compulsion explains why Zuko keeps recreating the scene. But there's another framework that explains why he can't seem to stop, even when part of him clearly wants to. It's called a trauma bond, an intense psychological attachment that forms specifically in relationships with an unpredictable, alternating pattern of cruelty and small crumbs of warmth. The mechanism is almost identical to how gambling addiction works on the brain. If a parent or any attachment figure were purely and consistently cruel, the child's mind could eventually write them off entirely. Consistency, even negative consistency, is at least legible. The nervous system can build defenses against a predictable threat. But intermittent reinforcement is different. It's far more addictive, because the brain starts obsessively chasing the next moment of warmth, convinced that if it just tries hard enough, that moment will come back, and this time it will stay. Does Ozai ever show Zuko warmth? Only occasionally, and only ever conditionally. There are glimpses, moments where a young Zuko is allowed to sit near his father, moments before the family fully calcified into what it became, small crumbs that a child's mind will cling to for years, as proof that the love is real and recoverable, if only the right performance can unlock it again. This is why Zuko doesn't run from Ozai the second he's exiled. This is why he doesn't simply build a new identity in the Earth Kingdom and never look back. His mind is holding on to those crumbs, using them as evidence that the man who scarred him is not a lost cause, that there's a version of him that can still love his son, if Zuko can just find the key. That's the invisible prison, not a physical one, a belief system installed by cruelty and maintained by hope. If Ozai represents the wound, then Iroh represents something the show almost never gets enough credit for. The slow, patient, repeated attempt to give Zuko an alternative attachment model, and Zuko's repeated inability to accept it because it doesn't match the internal rulebook his father installed. Think about how much of the early seasons is just Iroh trying to model unconditional presence. He makes tea. He tells jokes nobody asked for. He shows up meal after meal, day after day, offering warmth that has no strings attached, no performance requirement, no honor quota to meet. And Zuko, for most of 2 seasons, treats this kindness as almost irrelevant. Sometimes he's outright dismissive of it, not because he doesn't feel anything, but because his nervous system doesn't have a category for love that isn't earned through suffering. Iroh's gentleness doesn't compute as safety. It computes as static, background noise, something to tolerate while the real work of earning his father's approval continues. This is one of the saddest and most quietly brilliant choices in the entire show, because it mirrors something family systems researchers actually observe in real households. Children raised under a harsh, conditional parent often can't recognize a healthier, more available caregiver even when that person is standing right next to them, because safety feels unfamiliar, and unfamiliar feels dangerous. Zuko had a stable, patient, endlessly loving father figure available to him the entire time. He just couldn't see it as such, because his whole understanding of what a father is had been shaped by someone who used love as a weapon. Now here's where I need you to pay very close attention, because this is the detail almost nobody talks about, and it changes how you should read everything that comes after. There's a moment, roughly halfway through the show, where it looks like Zuko has broken the loop. He turns against the hunt. He aligns himself, at least in spirit, with people who actually see him as more than a function of his father's approval. It feels, narratively, like the turning point. But watch what happens almost immediately after. The instant his father offers him a taste of real approval again, an invitation home, a restored title, a seat at the table he was exiled from, Zuko drops everything and runs back into the exact same dynamic. Not reluctantly, enthusiastically. He returns to the Fire Nation, to his father's court, and briefly becomes almost a caricature of the version of himself the family always demanded. Cold to his sister's cruelty, dismissive toward the very people who showed him unconditional care, chasing the crumb one more time. This is, honestly, the single most important scene for understanding the entire thesis of this video, because it proves the loop wasn't broken by kindness alone. Iroh's love, real as it wasn't sufficient on its own to override 13 years of conditioning. The pull of the original wound was still stronger than the pull of an alternative. This is exactly what trauma researchers describe as the false exit phenomenon in survivors of coercive relationships, a genuine, sincere step away from the harmful attachment, followed by an equally genuine, sincere return. The moment the original source of pain offers even a sliver of the approval the person has been starving for, it is not weakness. It is not stupidity. It is the loop, doing exactly what loops do, pulling its subject back to the center, again and again, until something structurally changes. So if kindness alone wasn't enough, what was? Here's the answer, and it's more specific than he grew up. The cycle doesn't break because Zuko becomes wiser in the abstract. It breaks because of one specific confrontation, where for the first time in the entire series, Zuko does something he has never once done in any previous version of this scene. He stops begging. When Zuko finally, fully turns away from his father in the war and stands in front of Ozai, not on his knees but upright, he doesn't ask for approval. He doesn't offer an explanation designed to earn forgiveness. He states, plainly, what his father did to him, what it cost him, and that he no longer accepts the terms of the relationship as they've always been defined. Compare that posture to the Agni Kai. In the original wound, Zuko is on his knees, begging, small, desperate for the exact approval of the man standing over him. In this later confrontation, he's standing at full height, and for the first time, the plea is gone. What replaces it isn't hatred, and it isn't performative defiance either. It's simply the refusal to keep playing the same round of the same game. That is what actually breaks a repetition compulsion, according to the research on this exact pattern. Not distance alone, not time alone, not even love from someone else alone. Although that helps enormously, what breaks it is the moment the person finally metabolizes the truth that the approval they were chasing was never actually available on any terms, healthy or otherwise, and stops offering themselves up for judgment altogether. Zuko doesn't heal by winning his father's love. He heals by finally admitting, on some level, that it was never actually his to win. I want to bring up one more layer here, because it's subtle, and it's the kind of detail that turns an interesting theory into something genuinely devastating once you sit with it. Zuko's physical scar gets discussed constantly, in the show and in fan conversation. It's the visible symbol of everything that happened to him. But there's a quieter wound running underneath it that the show handles with remarkable restraint. Zuko doesn't just fear his father. For most of the series, some part of him still desperately wants his father's love, even while simultaneously hating him for what he did. Both of those things are true in him at the same time, and neither cancels the other out. This is one of the most well-documented and least understood aspects of trauma bonds with a parent specifically. It is entirely possible, and disturbingly common, to be terrified of someone and still crave their approval more than almost anything else in the world. These aren't contradictory feelings competing for space. They're two threads of the exact same rope, both pulling the child back toward the source of harm. That's why Zuko's arc can't be resolved with a simple villain defeats villain climax. Emotionally speaking, even though the show does eventually give him a physical confrontation with his sister rather than his father in the finale, the real emotional climax already happened earlier, quietly, in that upright, non-begging confrontation. Everything after that is Zuko acting from a nervous system that has finally, for the first time in his life, stopped waiting for permission to exist as himself. Here's what I think gets lost when people call this the greatest redemption arc in television. And I say this with total respect for how well-crafted the writing actually is. Framing it purely as redemption implies the core project was fixing a flawed person. But Zuko was never the flawed one. He was a child who got a rule installed in him by someone who was supposed to protect him. And he spent years faithfully, painfully obeying that rule, believing it was the price of being loved. That's not a redemption arc in the traditional sense. That's a recovery arc. And the distinction matters, because redemption implies the character had something to atone for. Recovery implies the character had something to survive. If you've ever found yourself chasing approval from someone who reliably, predictably withholds it, a parent, a boss, an ex, anyone, and you've noticed that the harder they pull away, the harder some part of you wants to prove yourself to them, you already understand the mechanism. This show spent 61 episodes dramatizing through a 13-year-old prince with a burned face and a stolen ship. The show's real insight isn't that broken people can become good. It's that the specific person whose love we're chasing is sometimes not the one capable of giving it, on any terms, no matter how much we earn or suffer or perform. And the only way out of that loop isn't to try harder. It's to finally stop offering ourselves up for judgment to people who were never going to rule in our favor. So here's what I keep coming back to. Long after the credits roll on this show, how many of us are still, quietly, running our own version of that lightning storm scene, still having the conversation in our heads with someone who will never actually sit down and have it with us, still measuring our worth by whether we've finally done enough to earn a kind of approval that was never actually available to begin with? Zuko got his ending. He got the version of the story where the loop finally breaks, where the upright, non-begging version of himself gets to walk away and build an actual life surrounded by people who never needed him to prove anything at all. Not everyone gets a scene like that, but maybe the reason this story hits as hard as it does isn't really about firebending, or war, or a 100-year conflict between nations. Maybe it's because somewhere in that scarred, furious, endlessly striving prince, a lot of us recognize the shape of our own unfinished conversation with somebody who was never going to give us what we were looking for. So here's my question for you, and I genuinely want to know what you think. Is there a relationship in your life, or in your past, where you've caught yourself replaying the same scene, hoping for a different outcome? And what do you think it actually takes to finally put that scene down? Let me know in the comments. I read every single one.